I played Flicker Strike for the first time last league, and while it was super fun to do tons of damage, the glass cannon nature of Flicker Strike Slayer wasn't something I personally could play long term. Fast forward to this league, after the introduction of the new Flicker Strike of Power Gem, I thought I'd give it a shot with Assassin while trying to move away from the glass cannon nature of Flicker Strike and really try to mold it into more of a well-rounded build. I started playing this build within the first few weeks of the league and really enjoyed it. The damage is good enough for almost all non-Uber content. This build rarely dies while being fairly cheap this late into the league. Realistically, you can get a character together for around 10 to 15 divines, and that character will be strong enough to do all non-Uber pinnacles. The main goal I had with this build was to be an efficient Shaper Guardian speed farmer, and that's what this build excels at. It's not the fastest build speed-wise, but the balance between speed and damage makes it great for the price. Now let's talk about how this build works. There's a few interesting interactions in this build, the first of which comes from the new sword introduced last league, Rakiata's Dance. The sword gives you inversion, which makes it so elemental resistance are inverted when you attack an enemy. Here's a quick example. When hitting Phoenix, they have a base resistance of 50% cold resistance. When using Rakiatas, the inversion causes the resistance to be flipped to -50 resistance. This is why we don't try to reduce the amount of resistance a mob has. If we were using something like Frostbite, it would only lower all your damage. Rakiatas in conjunction with Eye of Malice, the helmet we're using, causes the enemy's cold resistance to be increased by 50%. If we use the Phoenix example from before, this increases their cold res to 75% or -75% with inversion. Eye of Malice also gives us a ton of energy shield, so we can easily run a Divine Blessing setup with a 50% aura. For the chest piece, we're using a tool as Hunger, which makes you get a ton of flat life as long as you don't have any life rolls on other pieces of gear. I wanted to mention this because it's very easy to overlook life regen rolls and brick the flat life this chest gives you. Make sure that you're checking the rares that you buy or craft them for this build. You want 0 life rolls, including things like regen or leech. In the amulet slot, we're using Badge of the Brotherhood. This makes it so we have our frenzy charges equal to our power charges, and for the anoint you want Tribal Fury. This build does not feel good without Tribal Fury Anointed, so you definitely want to make sure you have it. For the boots, we use Relic Heshes and Patience. These have changed this league. It makes it so you always have maximum frenzy, power, and endurance charges. You don't actually get these charges in the form of a buff on your character, but you do get the effects of them without having to have a source of gaining endurance or frenzy charges. For the belt slot, we're using a belt called Oxium. This is a belt that is rarely used in any build that I've seen, and what this belt does is it allows you to get a ton of elemental damage with attacks for every power charge that you have. So since there's not many power charge stacking elemental attack builds, this belt doesn't get used very often. But for our build, this belt gives us 210% increased elemental damage with attacks, and it also gives us a ton of ES, which just makes it that much easier to run our 50% Divine Blessing aura. The rest of the gear is just rares, and since they don't have life on them, they shouldn't be too hard to get or too hard to craft. Just make sure that you get the Rage on Hit implicit roll that allows for you to use Berserk. While this doesn't give us a ton of extra rage, you still get a decent amount during the end of the fight, and since we want to keep this build budget, that's perfectly fine for the damage. There are different ways that you could potentially get more rage using that which was taken or using some form of Warcry scaling, but realistically it's not something that you need, especially if you don't want to spend a ton of money on this build. If you were super rich though, you could also get +1 power charge rings, but honestly it's never going to be worth the investment with how expensive they are. Let's talk about how this build works aside from the inversion mechanic that we talked about earlier. This build relies on the generation of power charges to ignore the cooldown of Flicker Strike. With Flicker Strike of Power, gives us a baseline of 50% chance to gain a power charge on crit. When used with power charge on critical support, you get an extra 54% chance to get a power charge on crit. So this basically makes it so as long as you are critting, you can indefinitely sustain Flicker Strike. Now there are some cases where you may get very unlucky with crits after a boss is no longer on full life, which can cause the cooldown to trigger. This is only an issue when it comes to pinnacle bosses and rarely happens. If you want to, you could opt for a diamond flask for those bosses, but it's actually not that big of an issue and only a slight annoyance, so I decided to skip out on the diamond flask. That's how this build works. Once you have all the items set up, just hold left or right click and let Jesus take the wheel. The goal with this from the start was to make cheap Flicker Strike, and that's exactly what this is. You get all of the joy of playing Flicker Strike, just with less damage, but for 1/10 of the cost, while still being able to do all non-Uber content with ease. In the future, I might try a higher budget trickster version of this build, but for now, I'm content with how it ended up. If you've been enjoying my content, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button for more PoE content. Thanks for watching.